Hi, welcome back to the Holley Hub. Today we're going to be doing an opinion piece on terrorism and how it affects our society. This episode is going to be an opinion-based episode, but we will back our opinions up with facts.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Dan Norman here, also known as the True Savage God. In this segment, I will be talking about what the War on Terror has achieved. The War on Terror has started, it began in 2001 after the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Our efforts have been somewhat successful on stopping terrorists. We were able to stop Osama bin Laden, which was the Al-Qaeda leader at the time. We killed him in, I believe, 2011, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it was either 2012 or 2011,
But yeah, our FBI and NSA have been uncovering lots of facts about Al-Qaeda and what branched off to be ISIS. We have frozen $140 million in terrorist funds. Our government has also collected and intercepted about 1,400 bank accounts globally, and these numbers are still effectively climbing. In 2015, the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia froze $60 million in terrorist funding accounts and seized over $1 million. Our system has done a pretty solid job on freezing accounts and assets, and other governments around the world have been stopping them from using their financial systems. Terrorists do have means of adapting and using other methods, including cash, and they sometimes do wired transfers, but they are starting to use less and less cash, but when they do use cash, it's usually a person carrying a bag or some sort of carrying device, followed with a handshake, and that's pretty much it. Just recently, actually, ISIS just lost its final stronghold in Syria on March 23rd, 2019. The U.S.-backed Syrian forces raised a yellow flag on top of a building in a town of al-Baghaz, and they celebrated a victory. The SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, launched the last assault on ISIS to enclave in early February. That's pretty much it. ISIS isn't really active too much anymore.
Yeah, so Danny, you talked about, a lot of the victories and the successes we've had in the War on Terror. But you didn't really talk about the setbacks. In Afghanistan alone, as of 2015, there were 2,300 U.S. soldiers had died in Afghanistan as of 2015. And in 2014 alone, in the first 8 months, that is, 2,300 civilians were killed in Afghanistan. Which actually was a 15% increase over the previous year. So what about those impacts? Is that really helping our war on terror? They already, a lot of the basis for these, especially the terrorist groups based in the Middle East, is that they hate us for a multitude of reasons. Aren't we just giving them more reasons to hate us?
I would agree. I'd like to intervene on that and say, yes, with those deaths of those civilians is giving separatists and terrorist groups in that area to give fuel to the people to have hate for the U.S. and other countries that combat along with the U.S. in the Middle East.
Right. So, civilian deaths, you drop a bomb on one house to kill one terrorist and you kill 2 civilians in the process, you just created 10 more, I guess I'm not completely convinced that we're having all that much success, and as is a lot of the public.
We can't just consider civilians a statistic and need to work carefully without. It's a very difficult thing to do, especially since the insurgents that we are fighting are not typical war fighters and typically dress in civilian clothes, shoot out from churches and hospitals and places that are restricted from being shot at due to the Geneva Convention. And I really don't know how we solve the problem of civilians being collateral besides making it closer combat to affirm that we are getting who we're supposed to be getting.
Right. Well, on to what Mike said about getting who we're supposed to be getting. One of the major criticisms of the war on terror is we go into people's houses that we suspect of being terrorists and we take them away from their families and they're never seen or heard from again. But again, we don't really have a lot of those cases. We don't have evidence. We suspect them of being terrorists.
And that is also a huge problem, and I believe that's even a violation of international rights of those people. And unless they have a warrant and the right to do so from the permission of the country's government that we are currently in, then I don't believe we should have the absolute right to just simply remove somebody from their household for being suspected and having no clear affiliation with a terrorist organization.
And going off of what Mike's kind of saying, we should base it off of the Geneva Convention and the ROEs, which are rules of engagement. If we're going to take someone out of their house, we better have a solid reason to take them out of their house and have authorization to do it through the ROEs.
Yeah, so, earlier this year, and for the past few years, really, there's been a lot of discussion about possibly closing Guantanamo Bay detention facility because of the people being detained there. There's a lot of concern that they're not being treated correctly and that a lot of them there...
Is it because of the blanket reason of terrorists that there's because there's nowhere in the Geneva Convention that specifically defines the word terrorist internationally, and typically it only applies to what we quote as soldiers.
Right. So I want to talk about this a little bit. The definition of terrorism. If you were to look that up in the dictionary, the term that would, the definition that would come up is it's a tactic. It's a tactic of war that involves a lot of the times targeting of civilians, specifically. And it's not just armies, or it's not just militants that do that. It's actual trained armies that do that too. I mean, World War II, Battle of Britain, bombings of London.
Yeah, it gets the biggest attention of the people and of other countries when they say we're willing to take the means to do what we have to and scare your people. We will do it, whether it means bombing your cities or vice versa.
Well, in the Battle of Britain, we were kind of already engaged in a war because war was already declared. So would that really be considered terrorism, or were we just using a war tactic?
It's blatant killing of civilians.
Right. Well, so that's what I'm saying. Is terrorism really? It's not a new thing, and we've known that. But really, it's not. A terrorist isn't necessarily a specific. It's not. It could be a soldier in an army. It could be a pilot, or a bombardier dropping those bombs on cities because he's been ordered to. It's what I'm trying to say is it's not just rogue organizations that use these tactics. It
could be even organized militaries, for instance.
Right. We towards the end of the Second World War, we carpet bombed and firebombed Dresden, killing thousands of civilians and
Tokyo, Japan as well. Napalming of Tokyo. Thousands upon thousands of civilians died as a result, and cities were left burning, and even more collateral due to that.
To add on to the cover bombing of Tokyo, when we dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bombings of Tokyo had way higher casualties and way higher death tolls than both of the bombs combined.
Indeed, they did.
Right. So, why do you think it's the U.S.? Why do you think it took an event like 9/11 to really have this war on terror start? Why did that kick it off, and not the stuff that was going on in Ireland or?
Because now it was happening on our home soil, and that's there's really no other way to put it, but we were really only caring for ourselves.
Right, so I guess what you're trying to say is it took us being the victims to finally, realize what everybody else had to deal with already.
There was basically a figurative and literal gun pointed to our head saying, if you don't do something, then it's just going to get worse and worse, and it's going to start infecting your soil.
But has it gotten better?
Well,
in what sense?
Have we been really successful in stopping terrorism from coming to our soil, or anybody else's for that matter, in stopping them in their own countries and in quelling that tactic from being used?
You know, that's a hard question to answer, because desperate people will do desperate things. And if it involves killing tens of hundreds of civilians in a nightclub with a bomb, then if that's what it's going to take for them to get their message across or get what they need to get done, then they're going to do it, if they are desperate enough.
And there's not a whole lot we can do to stop terrorism. I mean, we do have some means, but a lot of it's just really civilians that you see every day that can just walk out into the public with a bomb or a gun and start open firing or set off an explosive. We really can't detect that kind of stuff until it already happens.
Especially on our own soil. Because honestly, it'd be easier to essentially detect foreign deterrents or foreign people that would come to do such harm to our country. The problem is the people that are already here. I would argue that domestic terrorism is the biggest problem, not international, domestic. Because, and it's a hard topic, but your people have rights in your country. Foreigners do not have those automatic rights. And it is easier to get the materials that you may need to do such acts in your own country.
So, let's lead into the Patriot Acts with that. The Patriot Acts have been heavily criticized, by government officials, by thousands of Americans, millions of Americans, I would say, because it's been criticized as encroachment on our rights.
I would heavily agree with that as well.
Right. So, the Patriot Act actually stands for, ironically, it's an acronym.
USA Patriot Act, preserving life and liberty, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism.
Right. If you wanted a more convoluted name, only Congress could give you that. But broadly, what does the Patriot Act do? Allow the government to do?
The simple gist, I'll just go through the basics of it. The Patriot Act allows investigators to use the tools that were already available to investigate organized crime and drug trafficking. So basically the espionage tools and laws we already had in place for monitoring, we can use that to monitor potential terrorist acts.
So things like wiretaps.
Yeah.
Right.
Allows law enforcement to use surveillance against more crimes of terror, which may include electronic surveillance to investigate ordinary non-terrorism crimes such as drug crimes, mail fraud, and passport fraud. Agents also may obtain wiretaps to investigate some but not all of crimes that terrorists often commit.
Okay, so it's pretty broad in its scope. It's not very narrow, to what it it's not very limiting to how exactly they can.
And see, that's the problem.
Enforce
the main criticism of Americans and even foreigners is that it's very broad and it doesn't have a specific, sure, it can apply to maybe this area of people, no matter how large it may be, but not as hard. But it doesn't specifically and narrowly define who that group may be that we are essentially restricting their rights from.
Right. So that's a huge criticism of the Patriot Act, is that it does not define well enough what group exactly it's targeting, and it's more of a blanket it's more of punishing the masses by taking away a lot of rights from the masses, because of the actions of a very relatively small group of people.
It really is a group of it really is a punishment of the mass for the work of the little.
Right. So, on 9/11 we lost around 3,000 people, and that's not to be taken lightly, certainly. But when you look at the death tolls from other countries, and they didn't jump into these kind of things, it took them quite a bit longer to get to the point where they were this sick of it. And all it took was, the 91 embassy bombing and an attack on 3 buildings before we were ready to throw away our rights.
And see, that's the problem, is people in time of desperation and great fear are willing to sacrifice their rights for safety. In the words of Ben Franklin, those that will sacrifice liberty for safety will lose both and deserve neither.
You want to say anything on this, Danny?
And in my opinion, the Patriot Act is just another way for our government to infringe our rights. From what I know about it, which isn't a whole lot, it gives our government the right to bypass all the things that we already have active and basically invade on our privacy.
See, I don't 100% hate the Patriot Act. The problem is, like I said before, it is way too broad on not being specific in what we're targeting. Because essentially, in certain sections of the Patriot Act, it even allows the government to define new groups of terrorists. Like, for instance, the eco-terrorism, it wasn't even a word until not even like 2 decades ago. And the government basically used it to label certain groups of people that were essentially just peaceful protesters as terrorist organizations, so they could take their rights and have nobody question it.
Right. So, as Mike said earlier, the Patriot Act isn't all bad. There are some good parts, but, the biggest problem with it is just how broad it is. It encompasses, there's no one specific group that it really targets, it seems, and it kind of gives blanket power to the government, which is really kind of scary. It gives power to the government that, never before in our history has been given to our government. The closest I would say that we came is probably the Civil War, but it was given back within, after the war ended. But we're going on year 18, and we've seen no progress in getting any of those rights back. I mean, some of the good things about the Patriot Act, though, are it definitely helps law enforcement do a better job. They have been able to do a better job in solving more criminal cases because of one of the things the Patriot Act does is it builds in a process for for approving new technologies to be used in investigations, which is something that we didn't it was kind of hard to do before, but it's much easier now, which is a good thing. New technologies should always be able to be used once they're vetted properly. So that's a good thing, but just the overarching shadow that is cast on our entire society for 18 years, and there's no end in sight. Our government declared a war on terror, broadly on a strategy of war with no one specific group in mind, no country, no one country in mind. There's nobody to surrender to us. So how do you end a war like that? And our Constitution allows for our rights to be infringed upon during times of war. So by creating a indefinite war, you can have an indefinite suspension of certain rights. What do you think, Danny?
Well, Greg has a pretty solid point right there. The war on terror, there's really no universal definition of terror, so to know what it is, is to know a way to end it, but we don't know what terrorism is because we can't define terrorism. So when is it ever going to end? When will we get our rights back?
Right. Well, terrorism, again, it's a strategy of war. It's targeting a civilian population to achieve, a victory. Broadly get the other side to the point where they don't want to fight anymore. And they just want it to be over with. And, as dangerous as that is, it's not a new strategy. It's been used by legitimate organizations and countries and armies, as well as illegitimate ones, like ISIS. It's a strategy of war, and that's not something that you can ever accept the defeat of, and because it's not in one particular place. It's everywhere. It's unfortunately a strategy that has been used for centuries, usually by the most desperate causes, because it's effective, unfortunately, as horrific as that is. But the fact that our government declared a war on that, on an idea, on a strategy, is sickening to me. Because anybody in their right mind knows that that's not a war that has an end, unless you decide to just give up. Because you can't accept the defeat of your enemy, because it's not just one enemy. It's multiple enemies, and it's not just Muslim terrorists either. There's, the IRA in Ireland. They still are a terrorist organization. I believe it was 95 or 96 bombing of Omagh in Ireland killed over 100 people, and nobody really ever talks about that. It's sort of this thing that America's done. Other countries have been dealing with this and the fallout from this kind of stuff for centuries, and not just from Islamic terrorism, but their own people and rebellions within their own countries. They've been dealing with this for decades, if not centuries, and they've just learned to adapt to it, even though it sucks. But two towers come down and a hole in the side of a building, as horrific as that is, and we are ultimately somehow the world's greatest victim, and the only ones that are, have the right to reap vengeance. How is that fair? How did we flip that switch?
That's really a good point, but the way I see it, the world sees us as a suit of armor. We're basically everyone's white knight, in a sense. Ryan, what's your opinion on this?
Oh my god, I have to put your opinion. Both Greg and Danny are right. We're both a massive victim of terrorism, and we're both a white knight of terrorism. There was a 9/11 attacks in 2001. It was probably one of the most devastating terrorist attacks of basically our generation in that sort of sense, right. America-wise, right? But we've also had to go out and help defeat terrorism. Take a look at the war on terror that's been going on since 9/11. Terrorism isn't really a thing that can just be stopped in a heartbeat. It's something that spans over who knows how long, who knows how much longer this entire war is going to go on for, right? To me, there's no real definition of terrorism. There's no real solidified way of defeating it, I guess you could say. It's just different.
Right. So, Ryan, my point wasn't necessarily that we are the greatest victim, is that that's kind of how we've responded to it, as if we were the world's greatest victim, and, being the world's greatest victim, it's only us that has the right to seek the vengeance that we have, and that everybody else just better kind of fall in line, really. And on Danny's point of us being the white knight, we like to think of ourselves that way, but I don't know if any other countries really see us that way. You know, I mean, I'm not sure it matters being the last superpower left. I mean, we could theoretically conquer the world like Charlemagne, but I don't know. It's a hard thing to think of. You know, are we really the world's suit of armor? We like to think we are, but I'm not so sure. I think a lot of the times we're seen as the world's greatest bully, not the world's greatest protector. I don't know. It's difficult, but how else would you look at us when, at this point, we've almost invaded more countries than the Soviet Union?
Right.
Soviet Union and Germany.
Right. Overthrown more governments. We've overthrown democracies
Right.
before, and nobody really talks about that. But going back to terror, because we've strayed from that a little bit, it's not a war that can end. It's a war, we declared war on it, but it's a strategy that's been used for centuries. We've used it. We firebombed Tokyo, we firebombed Dresden. We dropped nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had very little military strategic importance. We've killed hundreds of thousands. They've only killed a few of innocents, right? They've only, we've only lost a few thousand innocents, and somehow we're the world's greatest victim. It just doesn't seem right, and if you want to compare body counts, sure, we had the single worst day, but we didn't have to deal with the repeated attacks over and over again, like a lot of these other countries have had to deal with, And obviously you could go into school shootings and stuff like that, but I think that is more of a societal issue and people just not understand, people not understanding how to deal with issues properly anymore. That's a topic for another day, though. So, U.S. PATRIOT Act does a lot of things, does some good, but the biggest issue with it is it's just far too broad in its ability to suppress rights. And for some reason, it keeps getting renewed. Couldn't tell you why. But I think at this point, everybody kind of just wants this war to be over. They're sick of hearing about it. They're sick of seeing people come home in caskets for a war that, nobody really believes in anymore. But what is the answer? You drop a bomb and you create 10 more terrorists. Yep. You go into the country and
you create 20 more.
You take a father out of his home because you suspect him of being a terrorist, and it's just not. I don't know if we've focused.
It's not right.
Right, it's not right. So what is the answer though? How do we solve this problem? Let's particularly focus on the Middle East though. Like, how do you solve the problem with terrorism in the Middle East?
I mean, and there's a lot of opinions on it. In the Middle East, let's say we were to follow George Washington. We're not really supposed to be getting involved with foreign affairs. So,
right.
From a diplomatic standpoint, it's not really our problem. But the United States sees that we have to get involved with everything. We have to fix the world's problems, which...
Right, well, that's going back to the White Knight. We believe that, we're the world's protector, and... that's got us into a lot of trouble. We lost 63,000 people in Vietnam. I think we lost, 20,000, I think, in Korea. I may be wrong about that, though. It might be higher or lower. World War II, you can't really make a case for that being unjustified. We were attacked. But, that attitude has got us into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And... you could possibly argue that that's what brought, this plague, if you will, of attacks on civilian populations to our shores in the first place.
Right. Now, like Danny's been continuously saying, oh, the U.S. is the white knight. We're the world's protector. We have to go defend every single country out there, right? Sure, we may have one of the biggest and most developed militaries out there, right? But take a look at countries right now, like an example as Japan. Right, Japan. Ever since we dropped nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they've been one of the, if not the quickest developing countries in the world. Right. At some point, who knows? Maybe Japan could become more advanced than we are as of now. Oh, Danny. Oh, what's your thought on it? If you're saying no.
No.
What's your thought? What's your thoughts on
We are the greatest country in the world. Changed my mind.
Greg?
I think Danny's a little enticed by our military, or rather brainwashed. Beautiful, Danny. Awesome. Yeah. I'm going to not grace our listeners with what you just did, but so let's talk about the players in this war, though. It's certain groups, but let's specifically talk about the countries on either side of the issue. So a lot of countries have actually been accused of and designated as state sponsors of terrorism. Countries like North Korea and Iran, Iran and Syria are ones that people know about pretty well, but a lot of people would be surprised that we designated North Korea. We designated North Korea because of the 1987 flight bombing on a Korean Airlines, which I couldn't find much on why they did that, and we took them off in 2008, but in 2017 we put them back on the list after they assassinated one of their own people on foreign soil, which I'm not entirely sure how that counts as terrorism. We've had political assassinations for decades. Well, more than decades. We've had political assassinations since there was politics, and we've never called it terrorism until apparently now. But that veil of it being terrorism, that kind of gives the government a justification to broadly do whatever they want, and that's a dangerous thing, because you designate somebody as a terrorist, you just stripped them of broadly of their humanity. It's a dehumanizing word, and it's perfect. It's purposely dehumanizing. It's not unhuman to, unfortunately, it's not unhuman to kill other people. It's not unhuman to kill innocent people. It's horrific, but it's not unhuman.
It's immoral.
It's immoral, right? It's not unhuman though, and it's depressing that it's gotten to the level that it has, but in some ways it's gotten better over the centuries. We're not like Genghis Khan. We don't, but.
Is that the communist side coming out of you, Greg?
Oh, right, Danny. Yeah. Danny's one of the America freaks. He's a red, white, and blue attack dog at his house. Feeds it pieces of small children. All right, folks, so we're running out of time here, so we're going to wrap it up. We love doing this podcast, and we wanted to thank you for listening to our views on terrorism and how it impacts us today. I mean, 18 years of a war on terror, and being our generation, we don't really know what it was like before. But thanks for listening, and this is Greg, Danny, and Ryan checking out.
And Mike.
Peace.
And Mike.